Hey there everyone. Today I'm out here in nature for a bit of an interesting lecture on Henry Miller's The Tropic of Capricorn. Miller is a really interesting writer because he's really able to embody the American spirit, combining this sort of libertarian individualism of some of the founding philosophical fathers of the United States, like Hobbes and Locke and even Rousseau, while also tarrying with the ambiguity of modern American existence. This work is written in the early 20th century, finished just in the midst of World War II. And that, of course, sets the stage for a lot of this work. It's taking place during the 30s, so during the Great Depression, tarrying with some of the most significant world conflicts. But, of course, America is sort of in the background of these conflicts. France and Britain are really involved in World War I and World War II, but the US only really gets involved towards the end of World War I and of course helps capitulate the whole conflict. And as a result, America is just now becoming a significant world power, and they really won't become the world power until after we get out of the Depression and World War II and into the Cold War, and it sort of becomes this polar world of America and the Soviet Union. And in this work, something that's really interesting is Miller is able to encapsulate a grotesque image of America while also embodying a spiritual, sort of transcendentalist look on life. We get as good of an introduction to Miller as we'll ever get on page 1 when he writes, "Once you have given up the ghost, everything follows with dead certainty, even in the midst of chaos. From the beginning it was never anything but chaos. It was a fluid which enveloped me, which I breathed in through the gills. In the substrata where the moon shone steadily and opaque, it was smooth and fecundating. Above, it was a jangle and a discord. In everything, I quickly saw the opposite, the contradiction, and between the real and the unreal, the irony, the paradox." So, right, Miller is in this state of apathy. In the beginning of the work, he feels like everything embodies a contradiction insofar as it's absurd. He speaks of this inability to decide how to rationalize actions because they might as well be or not be. They're kind of their own contradiction insofar as they're swimming in this fluid state of, paradox. We could think of Joyce's parallax, right? And it's very aggressive in the beginning. "I had no more need of God than he had of me. And if there were one, I often said to myself, I would meet him calmly and spit in his face." Right, so very, very angsty feeling that Miller is embodying here. And really, of course, this is a product of all of those conflicts that I mentioned, of the sort of disembodying of this sense of American individuality, right? You've got this notion of you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We'll give you 40 acres and a mule, right? And you'll go settle the West and you'll be a homesteader and you can do it all on your own. But then, of course, with the emerging global scale of the world, that mentality doesn't really work anymore. And each individual finds himself swimming in a fluid state that he doesn't really know how to reconcile. And Miller embodies the anger that I think a lot of modern and postmodern individuals feel. "In the bottom of my heart there was murder. I wanted to see America destroyed, razed from top to bottom. I wanted to see this happen purely out of vengeance, as atonement for the crimes that were committed against me and against others like me who have never been able to lift their voices and express their hatred, their rebellion, their legitimate bloodlust. And this is an important thing that, this book was banned when it first came out, and it was banned for obscenity, but we could also imagine that it was probably banned for being a little anti-American or un-American. This is the time of the growing need for a national basis for rallying the American people to the war effort in World War II, for men to go off and fight, and for women to become industrial workers, finally gaining independence, but under the aegis of this national movement where their individuality is subservient to a rather vapid and mythologized image, of course, of what it means to be an American. And Miller won't have any of this. He cuts right through this, and he has his own maxims that cut beyond the identity given through nationality or through race. One of the defining features of the American spirit we can see in Miller is the fact that he really desires individuality, doesn't desire universality, doesn't desire for his actions to be universally consequential or to add up to anything at all. He just wants to be able to find some equilibrium, some sense of profundity in the world. And we'll see how he develops this with the themes of nature. But first, he lists an interaction when, as a boy of 6 or 7, I used to sit at my grandfather's workbench and read to him while he sewed. I remember him vividly in those moments when, pressing the hot iron against the seam of a coat, he would stand with one hand over the other and look out of the window dreamily. I remember the expression on his face as he stood there, dreaming, better than the contents of the books I read, better than the conversations we had or the games which I played in the street. I used to wonder what he was dreaming of, what it was that drew him out of himself. I hadn't learned yet how to dream wide awake. I always was lucid, in the moment, and all of a piece. His daydreaming fascinated me. I knew that he had no connection with what he was doing. Not the least thought for any of us, that he was alone, and being alone, he was free. I was never alone, least of all when I was by myself. Always, it seemed to me, I was accompanied. I was like a little crumb of a big cheese, which was the world, I suppose, though I never stopped to think about it. But I knew I never existed separately, never thought myself the big cheese, as it were. So that even when I had reason to be miserable, to complain, to weep, I had the illusion of participating in a common, a universal misery. When I wept, the whole world was weeping. So I imagined. So right here he doesn't actually desire the universality, the likes of which we would get in Hegel, where each moment of history is subsumed under this collective project of die Weltgeist, the world spirit, that each human action is aggregating in this, this collective fluid that is die Weltgeist. And Miller probably thinks that this obfuscates the individual. For Miller, he just desires to be the big cheese, so to speak. And in his young self, he thinks this is what's going to help him, to be accountable to the universe, to have his actions be of universal significance. But of course, one of the interesting things we're going to see in Miller is his tarrying with the simultaneous interconnectedness of all the universe, while also having each individual part exist irreducibly as an individual, as a component, as a machine in like Deleuzian language. And a talk of Miller would be incomplete without some obscenity. And of course, Miller is famous for his sexual obscenity, but I think there are plenty of other ways where Miller just delivers us to the bruteness of the world. And this is often rather apathetic, and it's not really his fault necessarily. We can see from the start that he's grown up in a culture, in a world that has given him this apathy. So, for example, he remembers the case of his his friends called this his best friend, Jack Lawson. And Jack Lawson is sick for about a year with something. We don't really know what it is, but he sort of inquires towards his friend, but after a few months, he just gets apathetic. He stops asking, he stops calling and whatnot, and everyone around Jack is grieving at his funeral service. And he says, no, Jack lay there cold as ice and rigid and unbeckonable. He was dead, and there was no two ways about it. I knew it, and I was glad of it. I didn't waste any tears over it. I couldn't say that he was better off, because after all, the he had vanished. He was gone. And with him, the sufferings he had endured, and the suffering he had unwittingly inflicted on others. Amen, I said to myself, and with that, being slightly hysterical, I let out a loud fart, right beside the coffin. Right? And this is the quintessential element of what humor is in literature. Is it's something unexpected, and it's something that takes your mind so long to get used to that for some reason laughing is what we go to. Now, of course, laughing is not the only emotion we get here. There's also a sense of scoffing, right? Of his inability to understand the world, to come to communion with the world. And the whole of this book is partly a way for him to come to such a communion with the world, to figure out his place in everything that reconciles individuality with an interconnected sort of, everything being in a fluid state, in a fluid medium. Now, Miller finds himself a starving worker in New York, trying to figure out how to make a living. For a while, he just lives on this apathetic work of finding work and of purposely coming to interviews with a sort of lax mentality of, oh no, I don't really need it. I'm just going to kind of, have fun. But then eventually he actually needs a job. And he does get a job. But he's struck by the cutthroat nature of the business world. He says the whole system was so rotten, so inhuman, so lousy, so hopelessly corrupt and complicated, that it would have taken a genius to put any sense or order into it, to say nothing of human kindness or consideration. I was up against the whole system of American labor, which is rotten at both ends. I was the fifth wheel on the wagon, and neither side had any use for me, except to exploit me. In fact, everybody was being exploited. The president and his gang by the unseen powers, the employees by the officials, and so on and around, in and out and through the whole works. And right, this is part of the sort of labor consciousness, the class consciousness that's being initiated by socialist movements, by Marxism, and things like this that are opening up workers to the fact of their exploitation. And Miller is not necessarily, succumbing to this universal project of, oh, I as an individual can somehow turn this around. He's like, no, I'm facing the entirety of American labor, and I, just like everybody else, is being exploited to our very core, and this leads to a sense of competition that, capitalists will say is great for profit, but of course, if we look at kind of the mental health crisis, especially in uber-capitalist places like the United States or Japan or Germany, we can see that this doesn't have a great effect on mental health. And he says, but when you looked at it up close, when you examined the pages separately or the parts separately, when you examined one lone individual and what constituted him, examined the air he breathed, the life he led, the chances he risked, you saw something so foul and degrading, so low, so miserable, so utterly hopeless and senseless, that it was worse than looking into a volcano. You could see the whole American life, economically, politically, morally, spiritually, artistically, statistically, pathologically. It looked like a grand canker on a worn-out cock. It looked worse than that, really, because you couldn't even see anything resembling a cock anymore. Maybe in the past this thing had life, did produce something, did at least give a moment's pleasure, a moment's thrill. But looking at it from where I sat, It looked rottener than the wormiest cheese. The wonder was that the stench of it didn't carry him off. I'm using the past tense all the time, but of course it's the same now, maybe even a bit worse. At least now we're getting it full stink. And I love the aromatic quality of Miller's prose. He focuses a lot on smells, and I think the usage of cheese is a very apt analogy because, we all eat cheese, especially a lot of us whiter folks that can handle cheese. We just eat it all the time without really thinking about, this is this curdled, moldy, stingy mess that is just sat here and congealed into some strange lump, the likes of which, he's talking about this represents American culture as such. This low, miserable, stingy, stenchy existence, which he's trying to figure out how is he supposed to make any ground in this, and the only way he can do it is by being cutthroat. And as Miller is going through his analysis, he notes that there is a potential for some sort of reconciliation. Now, one of the things that's unique about Miller, or not really unique, but poignant about Miller, is he's not going to give us a project, necessarily. He's maybe going to give us a few maxims or a sort of method, but he's not going to give us some systematic account of the universe in its universality. He's going to look at the particularity of the universe, just like Joyce, for example. And he says, men are poor everywhere. They always have been, and they always will be. And beneath the terrible poverty there is a flame, usually so low that it is almost invisible. But it is there, and if one has the courage to blow on it, it can become a conflagration. Right? So there's this spirit inside that's kind of trying to burst out, trying to be something. And of course, part of the problem is the ambiguity of this flame, of knowing how to have the time to even worry about the flame that is the human spirit when you're being oppressed. Now, if we try to understand Miller metaphysically, we see that he actually has some commonalities with people like Duns Scotus, Heidegger, Deleuze, Guattari, insofar as he seems to be purporting a sort of univocity of being, which is, as Deleuze and Guattari say, that being speaks in one voice. And really, this is that all there is being. The idea of non-being is it's a non sequitur. It's a nullity we can't even actually manifest except by making it being, by making it be something, by describing it, by putting it in some sort of words. This is very similar to, for example, in Islam, how God is ultimately something that can't really be embodied. There's the 99 names of Allah, but those only kind of get at a sort of superficial aspect of Allah. And if you look at really early archaeological sites like Petra, for example, in Jordan, you'll see there's these strange rectangular prisms of sorts that jut out from the wall at, weird spots, and you're trying to figure out what they are. Well, that was actually the earliest instances of trying to depict Allah in architecture. And they were doing this by bringing out the geometry which Allah is supposed to be accountable to, right? This is the thing that has been bred into the earth by being itself in its most transcendent form, that being God or Allah. And in Miller, we see a sort of similarity insofar as there is an ineffability of being, but nevertheless there is an ecumenical aspect to being, of being all-encompassing, being everything. He says the earth is one great sentient being, a planet saturated through and through with man, a live planet expressing itself falteringly and stutteringly. It is not the home of the white race, or the black race, or the yellow race, or the lost blue race, but the home of man. And all men are equal before God and will have their chance, if not now, then in 1,000,000 years hence. And of course, the God thing is a little bit done tongue-in-cheek in light of, the whole spitting in the face of God that he said at the beginning. Well, clearly there's this idea that being is flowing through everything. This is the idea of the universe being sentient, basically. He says, who has the last say? Man. The earth is his because he is the earth. It's fire, it's water, it's air, it's material and vegetable matter. It's spirit, which is cosmic, which is imperishable, which is the spirit of all the planets, which transforms itself through him, through endless signs and symbols, through endless manifestations. So, right, being is continually manifesting itself in different forms, but being is impregnated in everything. That's what makes something be, right? If I say this book is, that is because there is something in this book, some way that it jumps out and is and exists. And this, of course, is being, and this is the real height of ontology itself, of the question of being, die Seinsfrage, as Martin Heidegger talks about it. And it's very deep, but Miller is somehow able to talk about it in this lucidity while also keeping the grotesqueness that links it to human life, right? It stutters, which is a uniquely sort of human way of talking about the imperfection and simultaneous perfection of nature. This is that eternal contradiction or paradox that he spoke about. Now, Miller has been through a lot. He talks about some of the coworkers that he met at this company, and his job was really, hiring and firing, basically. So he had to be cutthroat. Most people didn't last long, and the people who did last long made the people who don't last long not last long, right? It's sort of a competitive environment, and it gets cutthroat pretty quickly. And he talks, for example, about someone that he knew at his job, and he had been in prison for 20 years for a crime that he didn't commit. And this friend had relayed to him the anxiety of getting out of prison and being nervous that he was somehow going to get caught up in another crime accidentally and go back to prison, because he talks about the anguish of being in prison and how he didn't want to go back. And he was so eaten up by this anxiety of being caught again in something that wasn't his doing. And this friend ends up starting to confess in a court of some sorts. And he says, I'll confess. And with that, he began to reel off one crime after another. He kept it up for 3 hours. Suddenly, in the midst of a harrowing confession, he stopped short, gave a quick look about, like a man who has suddenly come to, and then, with the rapidity and the force which only a madman can summon, he made a tremendous leap across the room and crashed his skull against the stone wall. I relate these incidents briefly and hurriedly as they flash through my mind. My memory is packed with thousands of such details, with a myriad faces, gestures, tales, confessions, all entwined and interlaced, like the stupendous reeling facade of some Hindu temple, made not of stone, but of the experience of human flesh. A monstrous dream edifice built entirely of reality, and yet not reality itself, but merely the vessel in which the mystery of the human being is contained. Right? So the mystery of being continually unfolding itself through its different manifestations, and Miller becoming acquainted with this allows him to start opening up. He starts to see being in a new light, and of course he continues the pessimism towards society as a whole. He says the whole continent, that being North America, was on the slide, is still on the slide. And not only the glands need regulating, but the ball bearings, the armature, the skeletal structure, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the coccyx, the larynx, the pancreas, the liver, the upper intestine and the lower intestine, the heart, the kidneys, the testicles, the womb, the fallopian tubes, the whole goddamned works. The whole country is lawless, violent, explosive, demoniacal. It's in the air, in the climate, in the ultra-grandiose landscape, in the stone forests that are lying horizontal, in the torrential rivers that bite through the rocky canyons, in the supranormal distances, the supernal arid wastes, the overlush crops. as you can see around me. The monstrous fruits, the mixture of quixotic bloods, the fatras of cults, sects, beliefs, the opposition of laws and languages, the contradictoriness of temperaments, principles, needs, requirements. The continent is full of buried violence, of the bones of antediluvian monsters, and of lost races of man, of mysteries which are wrapped in doom. The atmosphere is at times so electrical that the soul is summoned out of the body and runs amok. Like the rain everywhere comes in buckets full, or not at all. The whole continent is a huge volcano whose crater is temporarily concealed by a moving panorama which is partly dream, partly fear, partly despair. From Alaska to Yucatan, it's the same story. Nature dominates. Nature wins out. Everywhere, the same fundamental urge to slay, to ravage, to plunder. Outwardly, they seem like a fine, upstanding people, healthy, optimistic, courageous. Inwardly, they are filled with worms. A tiny spark, and they blow up. Outwardly, it seems to be a beautiful honeycomb with all the drones crawling over each other in a frenzy of work. Inwardly, it's a slaughterhouse, each man killing off his neighbor and sucking the juice from his bones. Nobody knows what it is to sit on his ass and be content. That happens only in the films where everything is faked, even the fires of hell. The whole continent is sound asleep, and in that sleep a grand nightmare is taking place. Right, so as he's been aware of the cosmic scale of being, he's faced with the cutthroat nature of reality, of nature itself, and how this interpenetrates into human affairs such that we continue to embody, especially as we sort of grasp and accept the cutthroat nature of capitalism, this worm-like burrowing through of being that, of course, leaves mental health to the wayside and forces the modern individual to be in a slaughterhouse, constantly trying to find their way at the expense of others. And kindness just doesn't really pay all the time. That's one of my favorite images in the Marquis de Sade, in Justine, for example, where she has this image of virtue, where virtue always wins. But no. She gets taken advantage of, she gets raped, tortured, all of that, just to show the reality of the cutthroat nature of existence itself, and that this permeates, in Miller's language, through everything. Now, Miller develops a quite interesting relationship with one of his colleagues named Ulrich, and Ulrich even invites, or seems to invite, Miller to have sex with his wife, but he caveats that with, she has some problems with her ovaries. So anyways, Ulrich is very well-traveled, and he and Miller start having these nightly walks, and Miller is just infatuated by the vastness of the world that he never really seemed to grasp. And suddenly, he has this realization which really embodies Miller's unique ability to spiritualize the obscene, to combine the high with the low in a manner that brings to mind paragraph 346 of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. You should read it sometime. He talks about this simultaneous embodiment of the ability to procreate and urinate in the penis. And this sort of, it's a comical sort of contradiction at the heart of reality. It's one of the few moments where I found Hegel funny. But Miller embodies a similar thing when he starts to think about ovaries randomly. He just starts to, they've been talking about traveling, and then he starts thinking about ovaries. He says, in the womb, nails formed on every finger, every toe. You could stop right there at a toenail, the teeniest toenail imaginable, and you could break your head over it trying to figure it out. On one side of the ledger are the books man has written, containing such a hodgepodge of wisdom and nonsense, of truth and falsehood, that if one lived to be as old as Methuselah, one couldn't disentangle the mess. On the other side of the ledger, Things like toenails, hair, teeth, blood, ovaries, if you will, all incalculable and all written in another kind of ink, and another script, an incomprehensible, indecipherable script. And he speaks of this script as a kaleidoscopic change, always being in the middle. This is very reminiscent of the Guattari, by the way, and they even mention in 1,000 Plateaus, they mention Tropic of Capricorn and Tropic of Cancer a couple times. Probably naturally because he's able to embody this sort of in medias res, right? Being in the middle of things, which is how most novels start. But he kind of stays in medias res. He stays in the middle of things and never really finding a spot where he's content. But also he's thinking about these things that have a cosmic significance while being grotesque, obscene. I mean, ovaries, not to place any value judgment or say that's disgusting in any way, but it's the very innards of the body we don't usually think about. And he speaks of this sort of choral growth that came up inside him at this moment, until life itself became this which was denied, but which constantly asserted itself, making life and killing life at the same time. I could see it going on after death, like hair growing on a corpse. People saying death, but the hair still testifying to life. And finally, no death, but this life of hair and nails. The body gone, the spirit quenched, but in the death something still alive, expropriating space, causing time, creating endless movement. Through love this might happen, or sorrow, or being born with a club foot. The cause nothing, the event everything. In the beginning was the Word. Whatever was this, the Word? Disease or creation, it was still running rampant. It would run on and on, outstrip time and space, outlast the angels, unseat God, unhook the universe. Any word contained all words for him who had become detached through love or sorrow or whatever the cause. And every word, the current ran back to the beginning which was lost, and which would never be found again, since there was neither beginning nor end, but only that which expressed itself in beginning and end. So, on the ovarian trolley, there was this voyage of man in bullfrog, composed of identical stuff, neither better nor less than Dante, but indefinitely different. The one not knowing precisely the meaning of anything, the other knowing too precisely the meaning of everything. Hence, both lost and confused through beginnings and endings, finally to be deposited at Java or India Street, Greenpoint, there to be carried back into the current of life, so-called, by a couple of sawdust moles with twitching ovaries of the well-known gastropod variety. So, right, there's this acknowledge that in the sea of being itself, in this ovarian voyage that he speaks of, there is all these various things which are indefinitely different. They're sort of interpenetrating, they're engaged in this ecumenical state, which is being, right? Which is the totality of being itself. And I find it so fascinating that in this book, known for its obscenity, it can provide a link between that obscenity, which might turn people off, with the profundity of nature, with the things you see all around you. So I hope this has been helpful. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.